Chapter 29 The Story of the Scottish Templars. The story which connects the Knights Templars with Freemasonry in Scotland after their return from the Crusades and after the suppression of their order forms one of the most interesting and romantic legends connected with the history of Freemasonry. In its incidents, the elements of history and tradition are so mingled that it is with difficulty that they can be satisfactorily separated. While there are some writers of reputation who accept everything that has been said concerning the connection in the 14th century of the Freemasons of Scotland with the Templars who were then in that kingdom, or who escaped to it as an asylum from the persecutions of the French monarch, as an authentic narrative of events which had actually occurred, there are others who reject the whole as a myth or fable which has no support in history. Here, as in most other cases, the middle course appears to be the safest. While there are some portions of the story which are corroborated by historical records, there are others which certainly are without the benefit of such evidence. In the present chapter, I shall endeavor, by a careful and impartial analysis, to separate the conflicting elements and to dissever the historical from the legendary or purely traditional portions of the relation. But it will be necessary, in clearing the way for any faithful investigation of the subject, to glance briefly at the history of those events which were connected with the suppression of the ancient order of Knights Templars in France in the beginning of the 14th century. The Templars, on leaving the Holy Land, upon the disastrous termination of the last crusade and the fall of Acre, had taken temporary refuge in the island of Cyprus. After some vain attempts to regain a footing in Palestine and to renew their contests with the infidels, who were now in complete possession of that country, the knights had retired from Cyprus and repaired to their different commanderies in Europe, among which those in France were the most wealthy and the most numerous. At this period, Philip IV, known in history by the sobriquet of Philip the Fair, reigned on the French throne, and Clement V was the pontiff of the Roman Church. Never before had the crown or the tiara been worn by a more avaricious king or a more treacherous pope. Clement, when Bishop of Bordeaux, had secured the influence of the French monarch toward his election to the papacy by engaging himself by an oath on the sacrament to perform 6 conditions imposed upon him by the king, the last of which was reserved as a secret until after his coronation. This last condition bound him to the extermination of the Templars, an order of whose power Philip was envious and for whose wealth he was avaricious. Pope Clement, who had removed his residence from Rome to Poitiers, summoned the heads of the military orders to appear before him for the purpose, as he deceitfully pretended, of concerting measures for the inauguration of a new crusade. James de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, accordingly repaired to the papal court. While there, the King of France preferred a series of charges against the order, upon which he demanded its suppression and the punishment of its leaders. The events that subsequently occurred have been well called a black page in the history of the order. On the 13th of October, 1307, the Grand Master and 139 knights were arrested in the palace of the Temple at Paris, and similar arrests were on the same day made in various parts of France. The arrested Templars were thrown into prison and loaded with chains. They were not provided with a sufficiency of food and were refused the consolations of religion. 26 princes and nobles of the court of France appeared as their accusers, and before the judgment of their guilt had been determined by the tribunals, the infamous Pope Clement launched a bull of excommunication against all persons who should give the Templars aid or comfort. The trials which ensued were worse than a farce, only because of their tragical termination. The rack and the torture were unsparingly applied. Those who continued firm in a denial of guilt were condemned either to perpetual imprisonment or to the stake. Addison says that 113 were burnt in Paris and others in Lorraine, in Normandy, at Carcassonne, and at Senlis. The last scene of the tragedy was enacted on the 11th of March, 1314. James de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, after a close and painful imprisonment of 6 years and a half, was publicly burnt in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The order was thus totally suppressed in France, and its possessions confiscated. The other monarchs of Europe followed the example of the King of France in abolishing the order in their dominions, but in a more merciful spirit. They refrained from inflicting capital punishment upon the knights. Outside of France, in all the other kingdoms of Europe, not a Templar was condemned to death. The order was, however, everywhere suppressed, and a spoil made of its vast possessions, notwithstanding that in every country beyond the influence of the Pope and the King of France, its general innocence was sustained. In Portugal, it changed its name to that of the Knights of Christ. Everywhere else, the order ceased to exist. But there are writers who, like Burns, footnote, Sketch of the History of the Knights Templars by James Burns, LL.D., FRS, etc., London, 1840, page 39, maintain that the persecution of the Templars in the 14th century did not close the history of the order, but that there has been a succession of Knights Templars from the 12th century down to these days. Dr. Burns alluded to the order of the temple and the pretended transmission of the powers of de Molay to Larminius. With this question and with the authenticity of the so-called Charter of Transmission, the topic which we are now about to discuss has no connection, and I shall therefore make no further allusion to it. It is evident from the influence of natural causes, without the necessity of any historical proof, that after the death of the Grand Master and the sanguinary persecution and suppression of the order in France, many of the knights must have sought safety by flight to other countries. It is to their acts in Scotland that we are now to direct our attention. There are two legends in existence which relate to the connection of Templarism with the Freemasonry of Scotland, each of which will require our separate attention. The first may be called the legend of Bruce, and the other the legend of D'Aumont. In Scotland, the possessions of the order were very extensive. Their preceptories were scattered in various parts of the country. A papal inquisition was held at Holyrood in 1309 to try and, of course, to condemn the Templars. At this inquisition, only two knights, Walter de Clifton, Grand Preceptor of Scotland, and William de Middleton, appeared. The others absconded, and as Robert Bruce was then marching to meet and repel the invasion of King Edward of England, the Templars are said to have joined the army of the Scottish monarch. Thus far, the various versions of the Bruce legend agree, but in the subsequent details there are irreconcilable differences. According to one version, the Templars distinguished themselves at the Battle of Bannockburn, which was fought on St. John the Baptist's Day, 1314, and after the battle a new order was formed called the Royal Order of Scotland, into which the Templars were admitted. But Oliver thinks very justly that the two orders were unconnected with each other. Thorey says that Robert Bruce, King of Scotland, under the title of Robert I, created on the 24th of June, 1314, after the Battle of Bannockburn, the Order of St. Andrew of the Thistle, to which was afterward added that of Heirdom, for the sake of the Scottish Masons, who had made a part of the 30,000 men who had fought with 100,000 English soldiers. He reserved for himself and his successors the title of Grand Master and founded at Kilwinning the Grand Lodge of the Royal Order of Heirdom. Footnote: Acta Latomorum, Tome 1, page 6. The manual of the Order of the Temple says that the Templars, at the instigation of Robert Bruce, ranged themselves under the banners of this new order, whose initiations were based on those of the Templars. For this apostasy, they were excommunicated by John Mark Larminius, who is claimed to have been the legitimate successor of de Molay.